Thanks for joining me. I'm Nancy Zeman. Today on Sewing with Nancy, get ready to be inspired to add interesting accents to your next sewing project. Creative sewing specialist Barb Prohoda is my guest for this three-part series on Carefree machine embroidery. Welcome to Sewing with Nancy, Barb.
Thanks for having me, Nancy. It's a lot of fun to be here.
The trees on this four-season wall hanging are perfect designs for first-time embroiderers. The spring, summer, fall, and winter thread trees feature Barb's unique techniques that are easy and so enjoyable to sew. I'll start by showing you how to set up your sewing machine for Carefree machine embroidery. That's what's next on Sewing with Nancy.
Sewing with Nancy, TV's how-to sewing program with Nancy Zeman, is brought to you by Pfaff, the largest European producer of sewing machines. Pfaff's creative line of sewing machines and hobby lock sergers are simply the best. Ginger, a tradition of quality in scissors and shears for home, classroom, and industry. Ginger scissors and shears are the choice of professionals. Oxmoor House, the publisher of fine sewing, quilting, and craft books, including Nancy's books and the Sew for Fun collection Sew Easy, Sew Now. Madeira thread from Germany with superior quality and smart packaging to make it a sensational value, preferred by home and professional embroiderers everywhere. And by Nancy's Notions catalog, featuring specialty sewing books and unique, hard-to-find sewing notions and supplies.
Before showing you the four-season tree project, I'd like to start by showing you how to set up your sewing machine for Carefree machine embroidery. Thread is the most important consideration because that's what's going to be highlighted in your project. We're working with rayon embroidery thread. Rayon is very fine and lightweight, adds a lot of luster to your project. When working with rayon thread, then you need to use a machine embroidery needle. The larger size, the size 90, I think works out better, especially for beginners. The larger eye prevents a lot of thread breakage. So machine embroidery thread, machine embroidery needle. In the bobbin area, you can use lightweight bobbin thread. You don't want a heavy thread in this instance. I have a compressed bobbin here, or you can use lingerie bobbin thread, just something lightweight, about 60 weight of thread. This bobbin doesn't require a bobbin case. It just pops in your front loading machine. Any type of lightweight thread will work for this area. The bobbin, speaking of that area, we'll flip the machine open to show that bobbin case area. Give your machine a little cleaning out. I should say not little, probably a lot. Here with a little thread in there. And then if your machine requires it, a drop of oil to start this sewing project. And then we'll just snap in the bobbin case. Now my feed dogs, these little gripper type of mechanism, is controlled with this knob. I'm going to drop or lower the feed dogs. Notice what happens when I drop it. By lowering the feed dogs, you'll control the stitch length. So we're not even going to set the stitch length on this machine. Notice the foot. The foot area of my machine has a darning foot that came with my machine, or perhaps you'd like to use a large foot, the clear plastic foot used for machine embroidery, machine quilting, or perhaps just darning. It will not sit next to the fabric. It will sit loose so that the fabric can flow, but will give you some control. You'll see that in just a minute. One of the last settings on the machine is to loosen the top tension. You'd like that thread to be showcased as much as possible by loosening it by 2 notches or 2 numbers. I've gone from a 5 to a 3. You'll have the proper setting for machine embroidery. So you basically have the machine set up. I must mention I have a straight stitch, not a zigzag. We're going to do straight stitch projects to begin with, and then we'll show you how to set it for a zigzag and some other creative areas. The hoop. I'm using a machine embroidery hoop. You may have an embroidery hoop at home that is for handwork. You can use that, but unfortunately it's thicker than this hoop width. And this hoop fits underneath the presser foot area easily, and that's why we kind of like using this. Separate the 2 hoops, put the larger section on the table. And the fabric is then placed into the hoop. You have to do a practice run. I do practice runs regardless of how many times I've done machine embroidery, just to get the feel of working with this again. Then place the smaller hoop on top and make a drum tight fabric. We really want it very tight in here. Sometimes they even push that inner ring out just a little bit so that there's a lip right in this area. That will cause it to be a little with more tautness. And then tighten the hoop. Now the fabric, I'm working with a cotton fabric. It seems cotton fabrics or natural fabrics do not pucker as much. You can certainly use almost any type of fabric, but we'll start in the practice with the simplest type, with a cotton or denim might be a good suggestion. I'm going to place a stabilizer on the back side of my hoop and to give the fabric a little bit more stability, and place this underneath the presser foot area. Just slide it underneath. And now I'm going to draw up the bobbin thread. I'm holding the top thread, turn the flywheel by hand, one stitch, and pull up the bobbin thread. Kind of difficult to see that bobbin thread because it's white. I'm holding the two threads taut with my left hand. Place the presser bar in the sewing or darning position, lower it. If you did not do this, you'll have a net of threads or a nest of threads underneath. And then sew 2 or 3 stitches just to lock the threads. If you can, stop with the needle in the down position and clip off the extra thread tails. Now you're ready to do machine embroidery. To work with this, place your hands on the side of the hoop. You're not going to turn it like a steering wheel, but when you make changes, you're going to just rotate that hoop by the sides area. The first thing I kind of like to suggest, and which Barb will suggest too, is to make doodle stitches. Just loop-de-loop, whatever you'd like to work with. Now notice how I'm working with the hoop, not turning it, rotating it, but just giving it a gentle push on the sides. Many times what people forget to do when they're machine embroidering is to breathe. I know that may sound a little unusual, but it is a little different feeling because you're guiding the stitch length. It's not guiding by the machine. The feed dogs are lowered. You're doing the work. You may practice doodling and then some straight stitch if you'd like, maybe some outlining. However you'd like to work with this, just practice. And if you sew at a fairly fast speed without moving the hoop, you get a little bit more uniform look. On lighter weight fabrics, consider pushing the hoop a little bit faster. Now I am truly doodling. I have no idea what I'm making here, but just practicing. If you'd like to do a fill-in stitch, you simply just, with this straight stitch, guide over and over the area and have the threads work on top of each other. And it's kind of fun. Later in this series, we'll tell you about making labels, personalizing your work. So as you're practicing this stitch, why don't you consider to write your name or your initials? And that's another good thing to practice with. And I'll just see what I can do here with some initials. Whoa! It's easy to do this when you're not talking. Spend a little bit more time practicing machine embroidery with the doodle stitch and doing the straight stitch and fill-in, and then you'll be ready to begin our next project, the 4 Seasons wall hanging. Now that you know how to set up your machine for Carefree machine embroidery, Barb and I are going to show you some of her unique techniques. And Barb, we're going to start with the summer tree on this wall hanging that we showed you earlier. This is great. This is so fun to look at and fun to sew. This tree has about 2 different colors of thread in the trunk and the branches. And we're using a medium brown for the base, and then later on I'll add a darker brown for some highlights. Now we're going to do a little bit of a different step using a stabilizer, an additional stabilizer. Why don't you tell us why?
I like to use a sturdy water-soluble stabilizer, the kind that's clear, and use that to transfer my design onto my projects. And just put your paper with your design underneath and use a permanent type marker and trace off your design. Then you can apply the stabilizer onto the top of your fabric and just stitch right through it.
Now this is a little bit different. This is a pattern transfer kind of with that stabilizer.
Right, it's not actually being used for the stabilizer purposes, although that helps also.
Sure. We're just going to apply a little fabric adhesive. Make for sure it's fabric adhesive to the wrong side of the stabilizer. It isn't absolutely necessary, but it sure makes life easy to keep the pattern in place. And we're working with a high contrast of a canvas so that it works a little bit easier. And then I'm going to hoop this just as I detailed earlier, placing the larger hoop on the tabletop, fabric over the larger hoop, and then making a nice tight drum. Actually, Barb, I think it's a little bit easier to do this when you're standing up than sitting down. But,
yes, you get a little more leverage that way.
Yes, right. But get it nice and taut in there. So we have the stabilizer as a pattern transfer on the top, and then on the underside, before Barb places it in her machine, she already has the tearaway type of stabilizer underneath.
It's not necessary to hoop the tearaway stabilizer with your design. In fact, it makes life a lot easier if you don't.
It's easier to get the fabric taut that way.
Right.
So you're ready to do the straight stitch.
I'm ready to
stitches.
stitch the trunk. I have my machine threaded with a medium brown thread, machine embroidery needle in place, and a lightweight bobbin thread, and I'm just using a straight stitch here.
Right.
So the first thing that you always do with machine embroidery is bring up your bobbin thread and lock your threads. Be sure that you put your presser foot down.
Yes.
And a few stitches will lock that so you can cut off your thread tails. The first few lines of stitching that I do on the trunk are actually very small stitches, smaller than what I will finish with. These help stabilize the fabric itself so that it won't pucker later on. So a few base stitches, which are very small stitches, then I start stretching out my stitches a little bit and filling in the trunk as I go. I usually start at the bottom and fill it in. Don't overfill, just fill it in nicely. And I'll work maybe a 1/4 inch at a time, fill that in, and then work my way up the trunk. And when I get up towards a branch, then I'll just go out and finish that branch.
It's kind of like coloring you used to do as kids, just kind of fill in, only this time with thread.
The stitches look nicer if they are 6 to 8 stitches per inch if you had your feed dogs engaged. That's about the look that you want. The other thing I like to do is put the trunk horizontally so that I can see better where I'm going side to side.
So you have it lying on its side.
Yeah, the tree's lying on its side.
This particular tree is already stitched with all of the medium shade of brown, and then we would add some highlight of a darker shade just to give it a little shading. That's what I'm going to do now. I have the darker shade right in my machine and sneak it underneath the presser foot. We're going to repeat many of these steps over and over again to draw up the bobbin thread. Take one stitch by turning the flywheel by hand, pulling up that bobbin thread, grasping onto both threads, lowering the presser bar into the sewing position, taking a few stitches to sew, to lock the stitch. We'll stop with the needle in a down position if you can do that. Clip off the threads, thread tails. We'll get to those a little closer a little bit later on. And then just do some highlighting. Some straight stitches, not filling in as Barb did, just some accents. And this is kind of your personal preference as far as how much you'd like to highlight, but it adds a nice detail to the look of the tree and a little bit more realistic. So now after you have some highlighting completed of your tree, we're going to do Barb's kind of signature type of sewing, and that's with a bar tack stitch. Barb, you want to describe that?
We're going to do a stitch that I call a bar tack drag. And a bar tack in machine embroidery is just a zigzag held in place for maybe 5 or 6 stitches. The drag part is that I'm going to drag the thread to do the next bar tack. And we're going to leave those drag lines. You don't have to cut those drag lines. I've already placed a few of the bar tack drags in the grass here. That will be the apples that have fallen. And now I'm ready to do some up on the top of the tree. So I've threaded my machine with the red thread, brought up my stitch, my threads and locked them, and switched to a zigzag stitch about a 4.5 width. So I'm just going to do a bar tack by holding the hoop in place, turn the hoop a little bit, drag the thread, and do another. So it's very simple. Just keep moving the hoop as you go. I like to keep turning the hoop so that the bar tacks don't all line up vertically or horizontally.
Now again, that was about a 4 to 4.5 inch width of your zigzag stitch. The length you're controlling, that's...
Right. I just hold it in place. Each time that I do a bar tack, I just let the machine stitch. And once you've completed that on your whole tree, you're going to change threads and do a green thread.
Now, Barb clipped the thread next to the spool and pulled it out through the needles, just so she's flossing your machine. I've been trying to train myself to do that rather than pulling it backwards through the machine. That kind of gathers lint many times through the tension guides. So that's something we're all working on to improve a little bit on our embroidery sewing.
So I'm threading now with green thread, and that will be the leaves on the summer tree. So again, in the same area of the top of the tree here, I'm just going to do some bar tacks. And a good way to space these so that you don't get them too close together is try just to cover up your drag lines that you
sure.
have in between the red stitches. It's not important that you cover this embroidery completely, or the top of the tree completely. You don't need it solid. It looks better if some of the background fabric shows through. So you would just continue this until you finish the top of the tree.
And you just fill in, and it really looks extremely nice. It's so fun to do and very addicting, as I kind of found out making these samples. This sample shows a filled in leaf area of the tree. You can see some red highlights of the apples, and then the apples kind of lying underneath the tree. The finishing step is to put some straight stitching in the grassy area. My machine is set up with the summer green thread, a straight stitch, and I'll go down to the leafy area, again drop those bobbin thread, and tack off my threads, lower the presser bar. First I'll do a couple stitches for a straight stitch, stop with the needle in the down position as always, and then clip off those extra thread tails. We'll get those closer a little bit later. And then do the side stitching. Again, I have the trunk of the tree in the horizontal position, and I'll just fill it in, do the shading. Barb tends to stitch a little bit more precisely than I do. I have a little bit more free-form, Barb. I'm afraid that I didn't mow my grass here as well as you have on your sample, but we'll just fill this in.
And try to not completely cover up the apples in the grass,
Sure.
although it's good to have some stitching over them so it looks like they're really in the grass.
Sure. Doing somewhat of a realistic viewpoint. It'll take a little bit longer, of course, to do some additional filling in of the stitches. But when you're complete with this, then what we'll do is simply remove this from the machine and snap out the hoop. We had the stabilizer on the underside and the stabilizer on the top side. We can cut away the majority of this or simply tear it away, spritz it with water to remove the stabilizer that's inside, and the design is complete.
That's right.
We'd like to show you the other three trees, worked much by the same technique. We have the spring tree. This happens to have the three colors with the white and the pink for the blossoms, and then a springier green color. And Barb, you had a technique that we're showing you in the sample that you space the bar tacks a little bit further apart, correct?
Yeah, when you're using 3 threads, you
Right.
have to spread them out a little bit more so you've got room for all 3 threads.
Now, quickly too, we have the autumn tree. We have a light color of yellow, gold, and a maroon. On a dark background, you start with the light color first, and the light background work with the dark color. And you're going to show us a little bit about this winter tree, where we didn't do any of the bar tacking, but just side filling in for the snow.
That's right. The winter tree, I have the trunk already all stitched, and I've also added a little bit of snow in the branches. That might be a little hard to see on the white fabric, but there is some snow up in the branches.
Sure.
And the snow that's on the ground is just with a straight stitch, and just work it side to side, just how snow would lay on the ground.
Sure.
You can even build it up a little bit, just kind of drift it around the tree here. And you would just finish filling in. You could cover up the roots a little bit, and that's how you would finish the winter tree.
And also you have a little cardinal. I would like to show the cardinal a close-up, because that was just a straight stitch.
The cardinal is, yeah, it's just done with a straight stitch. You know, we need a promise of spring.
Yes. And you drew it on the stabilizer.
Right. And then with red thread in the top, you pretty much do this by hand wheel, just placing your stitches.
And it adds a nice little touch. So you can take all of these 4 designs, make them into a quilt, perhaps stitch them on a sweatshirt, maybe put them on a tote, but you'll soon find out that this is addicting. It's very carefree machine embroidery. In this first program of Carefree Machine Embroidery, Barb and I detailed working with the drag bar tack stitch and the fill-in stitches. This lovely wall hanging that Barb created with the trees from the spring, summer, and fall season were all accomplished in the same way, just by changing threads. And then the winter scene with the straight stitch and the fill-in stitches to create the little cardinal as well as the snow. I know that you could find many ways of working with this, putting it on a sweatshirt or perhaps a tote bag, but all using these great ideas. We'll be back with more. New from Oxmoor House, the Sew for Fun collection, So Easy, So Now. Quick ways to sew gifts, accessories, clothing, and more. Order now. You'll receive free 7 project cards, a pattern sheet, binder and dividers, and my new monthly newsletter. You'll also receive more project cards to preview for 30 days. No obligation. If you decide to keep them, we'll bill you only $5.98 plus shipping and handling. Then about once a month, you'll receive 2 new sets of projects in my free newsletter at the same low price. Keep only shipments you want, cancel anytime. Call 1-800-765-6400 and So Easy, So Now. Did you know that almost 70% of professional embroiderers use one particular brand of thread? That thread is Madeira. Now, the full line of German-made Madeira threads is available to home sewers as well as professionals. Today's sophisticated home sewing machines demand quality threads. When you use Madeira threads in your machines, they will stitch better and your finished products will look more professional. Madeira produces threads and flosses in hundreds of colors for machine, serger, and hand embroidery. Embroiderers prefer Madeira because of its tensile strength and color fastness. I use Madeira and I'm genuinely impressed by its consistent quality. You'll love it too. Welcome to Sewing with Nancy. I'm Nancy Zeman. This is the second program of our 3-part series on Carefree machine embroidery. Back again to share her enthusiasm and knowledge on embellishing and accenting with fabric and thread is Barb Prohoda. Barb, great to have you back.
Well, thanks, Nancy. You know how I love to share ideas with other sewers, especially ideas that use simple stitches and easy techniques and can be used to embellish either ready-to-wear garments or custom-made garments.
I like your approach. This first technique of this program features bar tack flowers and baskets. Barb designed this attractive design using a version of the zigzag stitch. The accents take minutes to sew and could easily be stitched on a variety of projects. Stay tuned for more Carefree machine embroidery ideas next on Sewing with Nancy. The first project of bar tack flowers and baskets is a 3-step process. I'm going to show you how to create the interesting basket using variegated thread and then add some stitching, straight stitching for leaves and then the bar tack flowers. Here's where I'm going to sew the bar tack basket. And I've made a small little marking so I know the width of the basket. Notice that my fabric is hooped as we have worked throughout this program in a machine embroidery hoop. I have a stabilizer on the underside. My machine is set up for machine embroidery. I lowered the feed dogs, I have rayon thread and a machine embroidery needle, and I'm using a darning foot, or you could use a larger foot used for machine embroidery. I have the widest zigzag set on my machine, and I'm going to first of all lock the stitches, lower the presser bar, and pull up the bobbin thread. And after pulling up the bobbin thread, sew 2 or 3 stitches. And if you can, stop with the needle in the down position and then, once again, clip off these extra thread tails. Now, this is the fast and fun part of sewing this basket. Sew 10 to 12 stitches and then stop with the needle in the inside of the basket. Then rotate the hoop 180 degrees and sew again 10 to 12 stitches. Stop with the needle on the inside of the basket and rotate back. And keep sewing in this manner until you've created an interesting build-up for the basket. And again, I'll stop with the needle in the inside, the direction I need to stitch. Now to sew the following row, I'm going to stagger my zigzag stitch half a width of the zigzag. So I'll raise the presser foot, advance to the next row, and I'm going to center my next stitch between the last 2 sewn stitches and stitch again. Now if you'd like to cover a little bit more area while you're doing this, I'm just going to move this hoop just about by 1/8 of an inch, and I'll get a larger thread buildup. I moved it a little bit before finish sewing, and then rotate again and just move it 1/8 of an inch and you'll get an interesting width. Now the basket that I have completed on this side is just about ready for adding of the greenery in the background. I'll clip this top thread and then clip it at the base again. Pull out the extra thread, giving it a flossing, the machine of flossing. And now I'm going to set up for a straight stitch with the green thread highlight for the background. This is just going to give me some foliage for the back. So I've quickly rethreaded my machine. I'll set it up for a straight stitch and now do some straight stitch adding of greenery. And I'll just do a few stitches, lock the threads, clip off the thread tails, and sew. Again, this is kind of doodling like we did in our first program. Because those feed dogs aren't in place, we're just adding some interesting background. And you can add as much or as little as you'd like. Remember, I'm not rotating the hoop. I'm just moving it side to side or up and down, however I would like to add that. Now, after you've added that little greenery, again, I'll clip the threads right next to the fabric, and then again at the base of the thread, and pull it out from the needle area, and I'm going to change to a flower color. On my little sample I'm sewing for you, I'm just using one thread color for the flower, but of course you could change and add a lot of interesting thread details. You could make some flowers quite wide, with wide petals, some with narrow petals. I'm just going to show you the widest width, and I'll move down to this little illustration that I've already stitched. Again, I restitched my machine, or reset my machine, for a zigzag, and now to create the flower, again I'll lock the thread, sew in place a couple of times, stopping with the needle wherever you'd like the center of the flower to be. Then after you've stitched one area, then rotate your hoop and stitch another petal. Stop with the needle in the center, rotate again. You could make some petals with some flowers with 3 petals, I should say, or 5. I'm going to do 5 or 6 here. And it will be kind of an interesting design. You keep on doing this. I'm just going to lock my threads now. There we go. Keep on doing this till you have enough of your design completed. When you're finished, you'll be amazed. I would love how easy this is to do and what nice little details this gives. This is the petal and flower combination I just completed. Here we have 3 of them, some going down into the basket. You can become quite artistic with this. On the shirt that Barb created, she added the petals or flowers in multiple colors, multiple widths, and if you would like, you could just add the flower combination without the basket. This is called a bar tack flower and basket, something easy to do for Carefree machine embroidery. Our next Carefree embroidery idea features a squiggle stitch. This quick to sew accent adds just the right amount of highlight when the thread and fabric are tone on tone. Barb and I would like to show you how easy this is to stitch. You know, Barb, when I first saw this idea, I thought this is great to add to really any woven or knit fabric, just a little touch of an accent.
And it can be added to either a ready-to-wear garment or one that you're making yourself.
But if you would be creating the garment yourself, we have a suggestion for you. When cutting out the pattern, roughly cut it out.
Right, you want to leave a couple inches more in the neckline and the shoulder areas so that you've got room to hoop your fabric.
So we've drawn the cutting line, but you can see the extra fabric that will be trimmed later on.
That's right.
As far as the design, you could free motion that, just kind of doodle if you'd like, or on this design, what I like to follow a pattern if I can. This is the water-soluble stabilizer, the heavy type, and you've drawn some squiggle designs on it.
The water-soluble stabilizer is just a really good product to use to transfer designs.
And if you'd like to put some fabric temporary spray on this, it will make it easier to position, hold it in place. And I'm going to match up my lines along the neckline and shoulders. And then as we work throughout this program, to place the larger hoop underneath the fabric and then snap it into place, making certain that this is drum tight. This will make the embroidery work so much easier, and I think you'll have a fun time doodling with this.
Yeah, I find that's really a key, is to have the fabric very tight in the hoop. And the stabilizer on top helps you get that. I have my machine set up and ready to sew here. I have my thread, embroidery thread in the top, and lightweight bobbin thread and a machine embroidery needle again. And I've locked on my stitches with a straight stitch. Now I've switched to a zigzag stitch, about a 4 width. And what I'm going to do is put my hands on either side of the hoop and just keep my hands on the sides. And I find that when you're doing something that looks like a satin stitch, the faster you go, the easier it is to get those stitches close together the way you want them to be.
Moving the hoop slowly, but pressing down the pedal.
Right, right. And the nice thing about the water-soluble stabilizer with this design is that if you don't follow your lines exactly, those lines will come out when the stabilizer's gone, so you don't have to worry about it.
It's just a guide, something that gives you some a little map to follow.
Right, right. And then as I get close to the bottom here, I'm going to decrease my zigzag as I'm stitching to taper it down just to a little bit of a point.
So as you were sewing, you were just
punching the button.
Decreased it. If you had a dial, you would slowly decrease it down to a 0 width just to give that nice tapered look.
That's right.
Let me show you the finished project again so that you can get an idea of how these little squiggles look at the beginning. Barb starts at the top with that about a 4-point width zigzag, tapers it down to a 0 stitch width at the bottom, adding a nice creative highlight. As you can see, very easy to work with. Creativity is what sewing is all about. This jacket showcases several extremely creative yet carefree techniques. The fabric is polar fleece, traditionally used for casual wear, but here transformed into wow wear. Barb has combined unique yarn details along with texture-adding machine embroidery. Here's how easily you too can stitch fascinating accents. We're going to start by working with the yarns, the bulky yarns, the fun yarns that have texture. Barb, you really chose some interesting combinations.
Yes, there are so many interesting yarns available for sewers nowadays.
And you would think that you really can't sew through these, but we're going to give you some hints on how to do this.
Right.
These are kind of blue clay yarns, thick and thin. You wouldn't have to go this extreme. You could use them narrower if you'd like. But we're working with the polar fleece fabric, as I mentioned, fabric that's traditionally used for casual wear, but we're going to make this great jacket, or a vest would be fine too. On this, we're going to use a sample here, but we'd place the fabric on the table and then lay the yarns the way you'd like it. And you've kind of laid them on vertically with a little bit of curve and shape.
Yeah, I have some loops added there just because that's kind of the way that the yarn wanted to lay. So let it fall on the fabric and see if you like how it is.
Now to position this, you could pin it periodically, or you could use again the water-soluble stabilizer to position it, to hold it in place, and then use the fabric adhesive spray just to pin it, quote-unquote, down.
Much quicker than pinning.
We'll sneak this little loop under here. There we go. We're going to use a hoop a little bit later, but right now we're just going to stitch down the center of these nubby yarns to the fabric. And the hoop is really going to be the darning foot or the large foot on your machine that acts as a mini hoop. And a straight stitch is the stitch.
Right. I find you don't necessarily have to use a hoop if you're just doing a straight stitch, and if you have the darning foot on your machine and you're working on the lengthwise grain, you're not putting that much embroidery in it, so you don't have to have the hoop moving.
And we're going to be using the clear thread because we don't want the thread to interfere with the beauty of the yarn, and the monofilament thread, and then a needle that coincides with it, the metafill, the filament part of the name meaning for the clear filament thread. So that's what I have on my machine. I'm going to do as we've done throughout this series and to draw up the bobbin thread. Now I just might want to say I always have a hard time seeing that clear thread. Here we go. I'm holding it on now. Put the machine in the sewing position and lock the stitches, sewing a few times. I'll stop with the needle in the down position, clip off these extra thread tails, and then simply guide the fabric with my hands so that as I'm sewing down the center of this, remember there isn't a feed dog here that's feeding the fabric, you're pushing and pulling.
Nancy, there are a couple of reasons that it is much easier to do this in free motion embroidery style instead of with a regular presser foot on and your feed dogs up. One of them being that you can follow the lay of the yarn much easier. Whether you have the loops, you can just work right around them without pivoting. The other thing is that some of the yarns, especially the thick and thin ones, are too thick in some places to fit under the presser foot. So they work well with the darning foot.
And now I'm going backwards, so I'll just rotate it and make it work easier. So this is how you would lay down the positioning of the yarns all the way around the fabric. That really goes fast.
Yes.
Then after stitching, you can remove the stabilizer, and I've started on this sample to take off most of the stabilizer just by tearing it away. I do save all these scraps, use these for buttonholes or other maybe small little areas of embroidery. Sometimes I cut away the large sections to keep them in big sections. And just tear this away. And then for the embroidery portion of it, we're going to place it in a hoop. Let me just show you the finished garment again so you get an idea of kind of what the next step is. Now, actually, Barb, you could just embellish it with this yarn idea too.
That's true, that would be enough, but if you want to add a little more, we have some ideas.
Here's the yarn that has been couched down. Now we're going to do bubble stitching, a new term for sewing, but these little bubbles raise the texture of the polar fleece. Barbara's going to show you how to stitch these bubbles, but before doing this, Barb, let's put the fabric in a hoop. We're going to use a different type of hoop, a spring tension hoop.
Yes, we don't really need to use a wooden machine embroidery hoop right now because we don't need the fabric drum tight. In fact, we want a little play in the fabric so that it will be allowed to bubble up with the stitching.
We'll put the larger portion, the plastic section of the hoop on the table, the fabric on top. Now the fabric, we have a sample here, but it would be cut a little bit larger than your pattern piece to give you room to hoop it like we're doing here.
That's right.
And then the smaller spring tension is pinched so that it fits within the grooves of the plastic portion. This isn't taut like our other hoops of the fabric, but it makes it fun to sew.
It also gives you some place to hang on to this while you're sewing. Now I've set up my machine with gold metallic thread on the top and a metafill needle in place here. And what I'm going to do is just stitch in circles, circles that are maybe a ½ inch in diameter, and go 3 times around a circle and then move to the next one, which will be attached. Kind of the way bubbles form. That's why they're called bubbles. And by stitching 3 times around in a circle, you get the fabric to draw up inside of those circles. So you can just keep building and building and make your circles irregular in shape, and some bigger and some smaller. The bigger ones will bubble more.
Right, that's what I found out when practicing. The smaller ones, I didn't get the texture that you created here. So big, irregular, fun-sized embroidery shapes.
Right, and it goes quite quickly.
I see that, it's fun. Now the other option that Barb added to her garment, she has some leaf or vine shapes. And this was accomplished by changing the machine to a zigzag stitch and doing some satin stitching, and then you see little buds at the end. Barb's ready to do the stitching, and you have your machine locked and ready to sew.
Okay, I'm ready to sew the vines now, and I have the same thread in that I had before, but I've changed my machine to a zigzag stitch, maybe a 3.5 or a 4 width. And I find it easier to stitch the vines working them upside down, so I'm actually working towards myself. So I start at the base of the vine, and this is done with a satin stitch, a free motion satin stitch. So stitch with the fast machine speed, or as I like to say, step on the gas, and move the hoop slowly. And then every once in a while, just kind of reverse directions and put a little bud, a little curve, and then a little bud into your stitching. Go back down a little bit and start another branch. And they can curve to the left or to the right. And your first pass, the first time you stitch it, it doesn't have to be filled in. It's when you go back on your line that's when you can really satin stitch it in.
While you're stitching this, I just might explain that earlier we worked with the squiggle stitch, and this is kind of that was a precursor to this. This gives you some...
Very similar, very similar. I fill in the buds just with some extra zigzag stitching, just kind of move my hoop around, and then again fill it in on my way back down.
Great.
So these vines or leaves are actually done with one continuous piece of thread.
Lovely. You know, this is so fun to see how you've combined interesting embroidery techniques and yarns, and perhaps maybe someone would just like to do 1 or 2 of these designs on the fabric, and that would be fine too, as on the sleeve of your jacket. You can see just these vines, how beautifully designed they go right down. I think that's just so attractive and nice looking. This has a look of boiled wool now that we have the texture and the stitching on here, but it is still this knit fabric.
Right. Although you have to be concerned about the washability. You have to have compatibility with yarn and your fabric. This yarn is dry clean, so the garment would have to be dry cleaned.
And to give the polar fleece some additional stability, you have fused a knit interfacing after cutting it out, after doing the stitching on the wrong side. And then the bubbles become very predominant and everything stays in place. And Barb, this is lovely. I'm sure many of us would like to create something like this, a vest, a jacket, or do some embellishing on different types of knits. Great idea. Barb and I would like to encourage you to try some of these embroidery techniques on ready-made garments. Since you can't put them in a hoop, as we did with fabric, Simply use a pressure-sensitive stabilizer that has a paper covering and then the sticky stabilizer. We scored the paper with a pin that we could tear away the paper covering and then apply the fabric right on top of this sticky stabilizer. And then you can do the embroidery. I hope you'll give this a try. I would like to talk about one of the fine underwriters of Sewing with Nancy. I'm sure you've noticed I use Pfaff sewing machines and sergers exclusively on my television show and videotapes, and there's a good reason for it. Pfaff machines provide the reliable performance I need, and they're very easy to use. What's more, Pfaff stitch quality is exceptional. So whether I'm using a Pfaff creative model for elaborate fashion sewing or a high-tech serger for home deck work, I know I can count on my Pfaff to help me do my very best sewing every time. And so can you. Your local Pfaff dealer is there to help and can show you the entire Pfaff line. Ginger Incorporated, the manufacturer of the finest quality scissors and shears, has been a sponsor of Sewing with Nancy for more than 10 years. Each article in their complete assortment is manufactured with care and attention to detail, whether cutting, nipping, pinking, clipping, or trimming. There is a Ginger product designed for that job. Join me in thanking Ginger Incorporated for their dedicated sponsorship. Welcome to Sewing with Nancy. I'm Nancy Zeman. This is the third program of my series on Carefree machine embroidery. I've been fortunate enough to have Barb Prohoda, creative sewing specialist, with me throughout this series to share her unique and exciting creations using thread and fabric. Barb, thanks for coming back.
Well, thanks for having me, Nancy. You know that I love to share with others the unending possibilities that free motion machine embroidery has to offer.
And your ideas are so fun to work with. We're going to start with a spiderweb design that was created with embroidery thread. We'll introduce you to a technique that Barb calls stitching on air. It's a variation of embroidery that will be sure to add a one-of-a-kind accent to your next sewing creation. That's what's next on Sewing with Nancy. Barb and I have our machine set up for machine embroidery. Just a quick review. The key element is to lower or cover the feed dogs. Most of you will be able to drop the feed dogs on your machine. They're not raised in this lower section. Remove the traditional presser foot and put on a darning foot or a larger foot used for machine embroidery. I have a machine embroidery needle, thread that's for machine embroidery, but this time, instead of a lightweight thread in the bobbin, I have both red thread in the top and bottom, which you'll see in just a few minutes. The other change is to have the tension at a normal setting. I'm going to put it back to the traditional setting. We want it balanced because you'll see both the thread at the top and bobbin. A straight stitch is what I'm working with, and because we're going to be making spider webs and kind of holes in the fabric, we need fabric that has some support. In the back of our denim samples, we would apply fusible interfacing. And then, as throughout this series, we put our fabrics in hoops, and we have the fabric taut in the hoop, a machine embroidery hoop, ready to put underneath the presser foot area. The first setting is to stitch circles because we're going to make webs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to draw up the bobbin thread, take one stitch, draw up the bobbin thread, hold on to the needle and bobbin thread, lower the presser bar, and sew in a straight line just to lock those threads.
It's the same procedure you use for every time you do machine embroidery.
So we've reviewed this a lot, but I think it bears repeating because it's the first step.
Right.
Now to make this web design, we're going to stitch around in circles, and not necessarily exacting circles, but somewhat looking circles about 3 times to build up thread. And Barb, you suggested that I really have a heavy concentration of thread.
The more stitches you have there, the stronger that edge will be. It might not look as pretty, but we're looking for strength right now.
And stitch as many circles as you would like in the hoop area. Now to advance to this other section, I'm just going to raise the presser bar to loosen the thread tension, and now I'll just stitch again. On Barb's vest, she had many beautiful designs, so we'll just show you two samples here. Then after stitching, we'll remove this from the fabric, the fabric from underneath the presser foot, and then just cut one of the openings, correct?
Yes, you only want to cut one at a time. If you cut all the circles that you had sewn while your fabric was in the hoop, your fabric would be weakened. So we're going to complete one spider web at a time.
Now it's a little bit easier to cut this when you're not holding it to a camera, so I'll get fairly close to the stitching, but you would cut it all the way around, trimming extremely close to the stitching line, which you have on your sample.
Yes, I've already got mine done.
Okay.
And in fact, I have my embroidery thread from the top, and the bobbin is locked already on the side. One point is that when you lock it on the side, be sure that you really lock it. Go twice as far as you usually do so that it's really going to stay. Now we're going to start doing the stitching across the open area, or the stitching on air. And to do this, we're just going to move the hoop in a steady motion straight across the circle, just like this. You keep stitching as you go across and go past your stitching. Then you can move over to another area. I like to cut this just like you're cutting a pie and go across again. And you can keep on going and have a general intersecting area towards the center of your machine, of your spider web.
You can stitch as many spokes to the spider web as you would like, and Barb, I think you're going to sew a few more.
Yeah, I think I'd like to add just a few more, just to kind of fill it in a little bit. Maybe another one right here. And now I'm going to start getting ready to do the center of the web. And to do that, I'm going to stitch past the intersection and start moving my hoop in a circular motion. And that causes a buildup of thread that makes a circle in the center of your spider web. And you'll notice that I'm stitching in a much wider circle than my stitches appear to be. That's because they collapse in on themselves. So then I'll take a couple stitches now in that newly formed center and then head back out to the outside. To finish the edges, I like to just have radiating lines coming out from the spider web.
Interesting.
And this can be very free form. And I kind of wrap that edge just a little bit, finishes it off a little bit. You could satin stitch it also if you wanted to, but I usually don't.
So this is just straight stitch moving forward and back. Now, we've used one color, or Barb has used one color to show the technique. Again, we had a balanced stitch, which is a little bit different than the rest of the Carefree machine embroidery ideas. But this sample that Barb has created with this lovely, interesting collar shows that we have different thread colors. Of course, you have that creatability. Here we have kind of a olive green, where notice that the center of the spider web is offset, so you don't have to do it exactly in the center. Another option might be to change thread colors and to have multiple centers or multiple center sections. And Barb has used both a rust color and a taupe color in combination, so it's kind of fun. Machine embroidery sewing is being creative, and so really we're just giving you some guidelines. You can certainly do some changes. Speaking of changes, we'll flip up your next idea. This is what you saw earlier in the program, the vest. This is really striking. It has beading in the center.
Yeah, I thought it needed just a spark, a little bit of highlighting in the darker colors of the vest. So I put silver beads in the center. And actually the beads were applied with the sewing machine, so you can do it all in one step as you're doing your spider webs. And I'm going to show you how to do that. Very simply, lock on your stitches. Be sure that you've got them locked well.
But while I was talking, we didn't explain that you took off your presser foot.
Yes, I did take my darning foot off because it would be in the way as you try to do some beadwork. So if you're going to put beads on by the machine, you want to work without a presser foot. So I have my stitches locked in on the side here. I'm just going to work my way right to that center of the spider web. And I have just a small bead here, and I have a pair of tweezers which help me hold the bead. Just going to put the needle down into the eye of the bead and drag the bead over a length of a bead away from where my thread is coming up. Take a stitch down, and I do this by hand, and then back where my thread was coming up, and that gets the bead to lay over on its side the way a bead should, and then back out to the edge.
That was really simple. So you just used the hand wheel to turn the stitch so that you weren't using the foot control when taking that stitch. So that's a really nice accent, and you could add a bead accent throughout any of your machine embroidery ideas using this concept.
That's right.
Now, one thing we'd like to point out, since this is the third program of this series, we're kind of getting a little bit more detailed as we go along. Some of you may be a little hesitant to do this stitching on air, and you have some guidelines, Barb, for giving some confidence to this.
Yeah. When you first start doing this, it looks a little intimidating because you think you have to have fabric under your presser foot area. But If you have a darning foot on, that's one big thing that will help. The other thing is that if you want to always stitch towards yourself, so keep rotating the hoop so that each time you stitch you'll be working toward yourself. Another thing with some machines that might be a little fussy with this technique, I find often if you switch it to just a very narrow zigzag, a 1.0 width, a lot of times that will solve the problem.
Or another suggestion is put a water-soluble stabilizer underneath the opening, and then you'll have a little bit more stability, and you will not be sewing on air, but you'll be sewing over the stabilizer.
The difference that you would have then is that your stitches would not collapse on each other in the center, but you'd still get a very pretty effect.
So I hope you'll keep this in mind to add a little creative accent to your next project by using heavy fabric that has been backed with fusible interfacing, placing it in a hoop, sewing a circle, stitching, cutting out the circle, and then doing the creative stitching to create interesting spider webs or decorative effects. The next Carefree idea is called bobbin work doodling. The main design is created with Carefree loop-de-loop stitching sewn on the wrong side of the fabric. It's an interesting concept, and like all other embellishment ideas in this series, easy to stitch. Here's how. We're going to be working with decorative thread in the bobbin. Heavy thread that would not fit through the eye of the needle, but yet can go through the tensions of a bobbin. The pink thread on this top has been worked with a pearl crown rayon, or I'm going to use a serger thread in the bobbin by simply winding this type of thread into the bobbin case, either by hand, or if you're using your conventional or you're using your machine, the bobbin winder, maybe you want to bypass one of the tension guides so you're not putting quite as much stress or strain on the thread. This design also has a couple of other portions I'd like to point out. In the second part of our series, we showed how to stitch bubbles in little fan shapes. Barb embellished this shirt in addition to the doodling with the bobbin stitch, these two other designs. I'll show you mainly how to work with the bobbin work, and then you could add those designs if you'd like a little bit later. You're going to cut out your fabric a little bit larger than your pattern piece, maybe 2 to 3 inches larger if you're working with, if you're creating this by yourself. If you're working with a ready-made sweatshirt, you could open one of the side seams so you could get in the area and work a little bit easier. This is to represent the wrong side of the fabric, and I've marked the sewing line of the neck and shoulder so I'd have a gauge. Now to mark the position of your new Carefree embroidery, we're again going to use water-soluble stabilizer, and on the stabilizer I have lots of markings. The first one you would mark would be the shoulder and the arm, the neckline seam, the shoulder and the neckline seam. And then at the center front, draw a line that's 8 inches long, about 3 inches above the neckline and 5 inches below. Then a crosswise line, another 8 inches. This T-shape will give you a position that you can connect the side of the T to the lower edge and then back up to the side to give this shaping for the stitching. The doodling, I have marked a section of this. You wouldn't have to mark the whole thing if you didn't care to, but leave room for maybe some embellishments of the bubbles if you'd like. The choice is yours, but I just positioned where I'd like those. As before, we're going to position this onto the wrong side of the fabric this time, not the right, but the wrong, with some adhesive spray if you'd like. This makes positioning a little bit easier, matching the lines at the neckline and the shoulders. And this allows everything to stay in place. And since we're working with sweatshirt fabric, the type of fabric used in our sample, I'm going to use a hoop that I like best for knits. Placing the spring tension, the plastic hoop, on my table, the fabric on top of the large hoop, and then pinching this all together. And this is just about ready to stitch to go underneath the presser foot area. But now for the setup at the machine. I told you I wound the bobbins by hand or used the bobbin winder in my machine by bypassing one of the tensions. And since this is larger thread, it's not going to go through the tension guide as easily as traditional thread will be. So we need to loosen that tension in the bobbin. There aren't dials on the bobbin like we have on the top of our machine. So at the screw area of the bobbin, I like to mark the position, the normal position, by placing a dot with a permanent marker at the end of the screw, and then the portion next to it right on the bobbin case. So after I'm finished embroidering, I'll line up those 2 dots. You could use fingernail polish if you'd like. Then to loosen the tension, go to the left and move the screw 1/4 to 1/2 of a turn. And this you have to kind of encourage a little bit. And I'm going to try that to see now how my bobbin thread feeds through it. And it goes through at an easy tension. That's the way we'd like it. Set up the rest of your machine as for machine embroidery. We're using a thread that matches the bobbin thread in the top or in the needle. I have a machine embroidery needle. I've dropped my feed dogs and I'm ready to do some stitching. I'll place the hoop underneath the presser foot area and first of all lock the stitches as we've worked throughout this whole series by taking 1 stitch by hand, turning the flywheel, pulling up the bobbin thread. Now this time the bobbin thread is decorative because we're sewing on the wrong side. Lower the presser bar and stitch a couple of stitches to tie the threads. And again, if you can stop with the needle in the down position, it will work so much better. Now, I have part of the loop-de-loop designs drawn here. This is going to be on the wrong side of the fabric. You don't have to follow those exactly. I never do. It just gives me a guideline where to stitch. And so, just the comparable way that we worked with machine embroidery as before. But you're not going to see the decorative stitches because they're coming on the right side. You can get these quite tight together. Again, leaving room if you'd like for some additional embellishment, but when I turn this to the right side, I think you'll be pleased with what you see. Now, I always do a test run. I would not start out just by sewing right on my garment, so I would suggest that you do the same. We'll see how this looks. It looks kind of interesting because of all the detail of the thread, the heavy detail that you see in this area. This is just a small portion of the design that I've stitched. I'll take another look at our finished garment and the highlights that are included in here with some metallic thread that was stitched from the right side. You'd unhoop the garment, put it back under the machine with right side up, and add those interesting embellishments. Throughout this series, Barb and I have given you, we counted up about 8 different Carefree machine embroidery techniques, and Barb would like to give your 9th one today.
Well, I just think it's important for people to take credit for the work that you do in a garment. So I always add a personal label to my garments that have a lot of machine embroidery on them.
This vest featured the last thing we just went over, the spider web idea in this last program, and it's done in synthetic suede.
It has spider webs done on synthetic suede. I like to work with synthetic suede for labels because you can cut it in any shape and it doesn't ravel.
Now, labels, sometimes we think of those small little ugly white things, but this is far from that particular description because on this vest, this is Brazilian embroidery. We didn't show this technique, but I love this label, so that's why we're showing it to our viewers. And, oh, you've added some of the embroidery detail.
Yes, some people might say, why put that amount of work into something that's in the back of the garment? But you know, I enjoy seeing it every time I put the garment on. So it's for me as well as for when it's hanging on a hanger.
And you'll see that in all of Barb's garments that she has one common denominator, and that's the name.
The name, I use the name Southern Belle or Southern Belle Originals just for my own personal clothing, and that was my nickname that my father had given me.
Oh, how sweet. And another interesting detail is that, as we mentioned, it has some of the techniques from the garment on the label, and you just don't sometimes just make the label specifically. You work with a scrap,
I always practice my techniques on a scrap of fabric before I sew, and then I save those scraps with the thought that maybe I'll be able to use part of them as a label later on.
This is from our second program of this series where we worked on polar fleece with couching over yarns and doing the bubbling stitches, the vine stitches, and now you could simply add a date, maybe your initials, whatever you'd like.
That's right.
So after you've spent time creating a garment, spend a little bit more time and add your signature by a label. And I think that's a great way of ending this series.
Thanks, Nancy.
It's time to wrap up this 3-part series on Carefree machine embroidery. But before I do, I need to thank our special guest, Barb Prahota. Barb, this was inspiring. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Nancy. I hope our viewers will try one or more of these techniques and really have some fun with free motion embroidery.
All the ideas that you saw throughout this series are written in a 20-page companion booklet by the name of Carefree Machine Embroidery, so you have all the details written down. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.
Sewing with Nancy has been brought to you in part by Pfaff, simply the best European line of sewing machines. Ginger, a tradition of quality in scissors and shears. Oxmoor House, publishers of sewing, quilting, and craft books. Madeira Threads, designed for home and professional embroiderers everywhere. And by Nancy's Notions Sewing Catalog, featuring specialty sewing books and notions.